Biskopsarna, near Stockholm in Sweden, the setting for an international conference on environment and development. The conference was organized jointly by the International Society for Ecology and Culture, the parent organization of the Ladakh project, and Friends of the Earth Sweden. Participants came from many different parts of the world, including Africa, India, Europe, North and South America, and Southeast Asia. The meeting expressed the clear common concern that conventional development, far from offering solutions to the world's problems, is in fact a major cause of social, economic, and environmental breakdown. A very different approach is necessary if we are to move towards truly sustainable patterns of living.
It's absolutely essential that we look at development from a broad perspective, not from the point of view of an agricultural expert or a technical expert or from the point of view of an economist, but rather understanding it as a broad systemic transformation of society. It's a transformation that's still going on in the industrialized world, but here we call it progress and treat it like some evolutionary force beyond our control. But in fact, it's the same process that we're exporting to the so-called third world in the name of development. And it's a process whereby culture and nature are made to conform to the needs of technology and the economy. And the technologies are coming out of an ever more specialized science, which means that the perspective is growing more and more narrow, more and more short-term, but in the meanwhile, the impact of technologies is growing greater, both in scale and in its impact over time. So it's absolutely urgent that we both widen and deepen our debate and discussion of development.
I think the discussions are even more important now because the development model, which many of us feel is already outmoded, is obsolete, is impractical, and is in fact very, very dangerous for the survival of Earth and the survival of humanity. This is something which many of the groups that we represent are increasingly aware of. But at the same time, the forces that are responsible for dominating the world and for perpetuating this kind of development, whilst we are all realizing that it can't go on for very much longer, maybe a few decades, the ones who are representing this kind of development have become stronger and stronger and want to create a situation in which they can not only continue with their plunder of natural resources, but they want to intensify and accelerate this process many times over.
The third world is sort of subjected to a war, a total war, with probably more people being turned destitute in their own homelands than any wars have ever accomplished within something like 40 years. We are being pushed into industrializing at scales that the North has never known. And it's needed for the North's business of capital accumulation. But every piece of mineral has to be turned into raw material for some industry. Every piece of forest is needed for pulpwood. Every piece of farmland is needed for agribusiness. And the people who make their living from those lands have to be pushed out.
So we now have this cliche that poverty is the main cause of environmental problems. And I beg to differ. I think that the reverse is true. Affluence is the main cause of environmental problems, and environmental problems are now becoming the major cause of poverty.
The pressure on resources does not come from numbers. The pressure on resources comes from killing the relationship of nurturance communities have with their ecosystems. That's the single most important point at which degradation starts. Distant industrialists have never had that level of nurturance. For them, everything has been a mine. You exploit it, dump it. Local people have a possibility to have that relationship. But if you want to turn other people's commons into your commodities, the first thing you have to do is kill that relationship of nurturance and belonging.
One of the most disastrous impacts of development is that it's eroding diversity everywhere. And it isn't just biological diversity, it's cultural diversity. And cultural and biological diversity are directly linked. Previously, we had different cultures all around the world because people were responding to the specific ecosystem where they lived. So you had the architecture reflecting the climate and the materials that were locally available, the food they ate, the clothing they wore, were all related to the place where they lived, or at least to the region where they lived. Now development is everywhere introducing the same standardized monoculture and training people to work in an economy where they end up competing for the same industrial resources.
We have been taught to think that this is progress because we think, and we've been taught that all benefits are derived from the workings of the technosphere, this organization of matter that economic development builds up, the world of cement, you see. All benefits are man-made. Health is something you acquire in hospitals. You take enough pills and see enough doctors, you're healthy. And it's like that for everything. Everything, fertility is something provided by NPK, nitrogen, potassium, phosphates. It's artificial fertilizers that creates fertility. You see, we think that all benefits are man-made. Therefore, we want progress must mean maximizing man-made benefits. How do you do that? By economic development. Now, the problem is we are hooked. Our whole modern society is hooked on economic development. Here's a typical example. We're hooked on building these massive dams because everybody, all the people who matter in our society, the governments, the big corporations, you see, building organizations, development agencies, all make something out of building them. And it's like that for everything. It's not just dams. It's like that for nuclear power stations. It's like that for all our highway programs. It's like that for just about everything. We are hooked onto the process that is destroying this planet, and that if it goes on long enough, is going to make our species extinct. And that, I'm not talking about a few hundred years from now, I'm talking about a few decades from now. We interpret our problems in such a way as to make them appear amenable to the only solutions we can apply, which are those involving further building, further development. You see, people are sick, you see, you need more hospitals. He doesn't say, let's not pollute them, let's give them good food. You see, let's let them take exercise. No, we need to build more hospitals, provide them with more pills, have more pharmaceutical companies. Whatever the problem is, you see, it's got to rationalize further development.
So we have, on one hand, the accelerating and continuous growth of the world economy, which in ecological terms means the greater and greater depletion of natural resources and the whole crisis of the environment and so on, which we are familiar with. And on the other hand, this growth taking place in a very uneven, unfair manner, over-concentrated in countries of the north and some parts of some cities in the south, whose elites are also enjoying and taking part in this system. Whilst the large majority of humanity is going from bad to worse, we must be prepared to accept the fact that for the very powerful people in the north, they are willing to go to all means possible to maintain their power and to strengthen their power even further. To many of us in the south, that was the lesson of the war which the United States fought against Iraq. The message of the United States being that the world's resources belong to the people in the north. Even if some of these resources accidentally, due to geographical reasons, due probably to a mistake which God has made, accidentally some of these resources are located in the south. This is the model of development which we are facing. On the political side, we have people who are willing to wage vicious military wars. On the economic side, we now have the Uruguay round, in which the multinationals want to have even more and more freedom to do whatever they want to do any part of the world. And if you want to try to regulate or to stop them, because you want to retain some economic sovereignty, then that is considered against free trade and therefore against international law.
If you go back to Bretton Woods in 1944, when we set up the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was set up 4 years later. It was a part of the plan explicitly stated there that in order to prevent the recurrence of the sort of slump, sort of recession, crash we had in 1929, which limited economic development almost until the last war, the way to avoid this was to bring the third world within the orbit of our economic activities.
Generally, what the whole process of development is doing is creating dependence. It's training people away from an ability to provide for themselves from their own resources and creating a dependence on faraway markets. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is to destroy agriculture, to destroy the small farmer. And if you look at what happened in the industrialized world, over about 100 years, we pulled more than 90% of the population away from agriculture. And now we're exporting this model to the third world and systematically destroying the farmer, pulling people into ever larger urban conglomerates where they become dependent on packaged food and all basic needs come from further and further away.
The first cause of starvation in the world is the export-led economy, which we are foisting on to the third world. You see, when third world countries borrow over and above their quota with the IMF, they have to sign IMF conditionalities. One of them is that they reorient their economy towards exports, and in particular that they export their food. They also have to undertake to mechanize their agriculture. So they're forced to do two of the worst possible things they can do. Number one, export their food. So most third world countries today, anything up to 70% of the good agricultural land is used for export crops. Now how can you possibly feed people if you export their food? You either export it or you eat it. You can't do both. Now all these third world countries are starving largely because all the food is being exported. Secondly, you've got to mechanize your agriculture, partly to satisfy IMF conditionalities, partly because the FAO is pushing them to do that, partly because the agrochemical industry is pushing them to buy the agrochemicals, and the farm machinery companies doing likewise, etc. But once you start doing that, you have to have very large plantations because small farms can't afford all these inputs. So you're already using means of production which are very destructive to the soil. So not only are you exporting people's food, but you're turning all the land into a desert. And if you use irrigated agriculture, you're going to turn it into salt. What you don't turn into a normal desert, you turn into a salt desert. Worse than that, you then push all the people into the slums. Because as I said earlier, people can't afford, small farmers can't afford to buy all the inputs. They're pushed off the land. So they're all pushed off into the slums. It's very simple. India has 800 million people. 600 million live off the land. If you adopt modern agriculture, which is what we want to do, we get farms of 500 acres, and we have 2 or 3% of the population producing the food for everybody else. You'll be able to produce the food with 20 million people. What do you do with the other 580 million? Shoot them? That'd be the honest and the most humane thing to do. But we won't. We push them into the slums.
Another effect of development is on people's self-esteem and on their sense of identity. I've been living for the last 17 years in Ladakh, or Little Tibet, and I've been there literally from the beginning of the whole development process. I came to Ladakh before the West had entered people's consciousness, and I learned to speak the language fluently. And in the early years, I was in a particularly beautiful village where all the houses were 3 stories high and painted white. And just out of curiosity, I asked a young man from that village to show me the poorest house in his village. And he thought for a bit, and then he said, "We don't have any poor houses." The same person I heard 8 years later say to a tourist, "Oh, if you could only help us Ladakhis, we're so poor." And what had happened within those 8 years is that he had been bombarded with images of an urban, modern life, a far-away Western model where it looks as though you never work and you have infinite amounts of money. And in the process, he had decided that he himself was backward and poor and even stupid and in all ways inferior. And I've seen also firsthand that this sense of inferiority is producing a terrible anger and violence and leading to friction between local groups. So that in Ladakh we've actually seen violent friction erupt between the local Buddhist and Muslim groups in the area as a direct consequence of development.
One thing we face across the world is any kind of religious resurgence. It's happening in America, it's happening in the Middle East, it's happening everywhere. But resurgence of Sikhism was really an outcome of the impact of the Green Revolution, very clearly, very directly. The religious leaders that came up in the 80s were basically saying the Green Revolution has destroyed our culture. It has destroyed our sense of moral values. It has destroyed our sense of what is right and wrong. It has made money the master of everything. No good society and no good community can live in this moral vacuum. Therefore, we have to revive Sikhism to give direction to ourselves ethically. That's part of what the resurgence was about. Every day, since 1984, or even earlier, since 1982, every day 10 to 15 people are being killed in Punjab because of the total rupture of the systems of production, total breakdown of community, a total individualization of the community, and 20 years later, erosion of the productivity base, an erosion of the soils, desertification, deficiencies of the soil, pest outbreaks, absolute impossibility for farmers to get enough returns on what they had put in terms of purchase of inputs like chemicals and seeds and energy. In Punjab, the lessons are not being learned because no one is seeing the violence in Punjab as an outcome of that violent transformation. People are seeing that as a problem arising from cultural diversity. Hindus and Sikhs can't live together. They got to kill each other. So cultural diversity, which was not a problem before this technocratic violation, is turned into a problem and is treated as if it's the cause of the instabilities that are actually products of a different transformation.
One of the biggest problems is the fixation on economic criteria and on GNP. It's true in the north as well as the south, but it's particularly true in the south, where you literally have millions of people living in a locally based rural economy. And everything they have, as long as it is not connected to and dependent on the macroeconomy, is considered zero. It's simply not accounted for. So a farmer in Ladakh who has many fields, lots of animals, a large house, maybe several houses, is considered a complete pauper. The whole subsistence economy is zero. Now, when you do that, it means that on paper it looks like progress. If you pull those same people away from the land into an urban job, even if they only earn $1 a day, this is progress, because what they had before was nothing.
The whole way of accounting is just farcical. It's utterly farcical. Modern economics has to be rewritten from scratch. It's based on totally false assumptions. The assumption that wealth is man-made material goods, electric toothbrushes, plastic buckets, plastic Mickey Mouses, things of this sort, you see, and that everything must be destroyed to provide that. The assumption is false, completely false.
The modern technological system has so destroyed the world that it is not only the biosphere that is affected, the atmosphere, the water systems, the lands and so on, but even our own human bodies are being mutated, not only in terms of the cancer cells that are developing in our bodies, but the very nature of the human gene is changing because of the amount of chemicals and poisons and so on which we are eating and breathing in and so on.
It's very serious. If you just think of how industrialization of 200 years ago based on fossil fuel is causing the greenhouse effect of today. If you think of how industrial agriculture of 20 years ago has totally destituted our soils and our water systems. But something far more serious is happening today in the 90s. And that is that the past industrializations are nothing compared to the new industrialization planned to keep the economic system going. Because the last colonies will be inhabited and enclosed in this. And the last colonies, really, all land has been colonized. waters have been colonized, forests have been colonized. Really, the only colonies left are living systems, living plants, animals, and women's bodies. And those are the sites of new investment through the new biotechnologies. The US has already laws and decisions that allow the ownership of life through patent changes. And the European community is also following up in that. This is basically needed because if plants can grow on their own, if my seed from this year can give me food for next year, how does capital make money? If I have a natural childbirth, where does a medical establishment grow around it to spin economic growth? Somewhere, an intervention has to happen in these processes of self-regeneration. Given that life itself is having to be redefined to make the next phase of industrialization possible, the deadening of our minds will probably, if they have their way, will be much faster than the deadening of this planet. And if that happens, there's no recovery.
If you look at the situation today, 20% of the world's population living in the north are consuming 80% of the world's resources because they have 80% of the world's income every year. And the only way in which we can reduce the environment crisis and eventually stop it, hopefully, is for this wasteful consumption to be reduced and to come to a stop. In other words, the kind of lifestyle which you are having in northern, quote-unquote, civilization. I don't say Western civilization because there are other parts of the north which may not be Western. So that kind of a lifestyle which is wasteful, which is alienating and so on, it has to change very drastically. We have to reduce the level of consumption overall, but reduce it in such a way that the poor people do not bear the brunt of this adjustment.
We've got to get back to small communities. We've got to make sure that economic activities are conducted within these communities on a very much smaller scale, catering for a very much smaller market, free market if you like, but a free market on a very much smaller scale, the village market, or if you like a regional market. We've got to reduce the scale of these activities in order to reduce very, very drastically indeed the impact of all our activities on the environment, which cannot support this impact anymore.
We need to look at agricultural policy side by side with transport policy. And if we do that, we'll see that governments almost everywhere are spending more and more money to expand the transport infrastructure, to bring biscuits and apples and potatoes from ever further away. And there's also enormous amounts of money going into research on how to prolong the shelf life of food. And this is not in our interest. It's not in the interest of health to have food from further and further away. On the contrary, it's much healthier and better to have locally produced food. And this is healthier for the ecosystem. It would mean a reduction in transport, which means a reduction in pollution. So we need to make it a priority to actually shorten the links between producers and consumers rather than distancing them ever further. And economically, if one takes into account all the costs, the health costs, both to the individual and to natural ecosystems, this is obviously also going to be less expensive.
I can provide you catalogues of evidence to show that the small farm is very much more productive than the big one. There's no comparison. If you're measuring food per acre, which is what is important, small farm produces very much more food. It's done with very much more care. There's an Indian farmer at this meeting, and he has a 25-acre farm. There are 35 families living off this farm. You wouldn't think that possible. 35 families. The amount of food they produce is astonishing.
One of the most effective ways of pulling people away from the land is through conventional education. Everywhere on the planet, when we say that people are educated, we mean that they've had a Western education. And a Western education is fundamentally an urban education, teaching you how to be a specialized urban consumer. Children learn nothing about their own environment, about their own cultural roots, and above all, about their own resources and their own economy. And so that, in fact, it's a very effective way of pulling people into the macroeconomy.
Modern knowledge serves above all to legitimize the modern policies of economic development. You see. So we need to educate people into a very different way. We need to rewrite these subjects. You can't see that polluting the world is very important. You can't see cutting down forests. You still believe that economic progress is what really matters. It does matter. It's a small side effect. When you see the whole picture, you will see you can no longer sustain that argument. Suddenly everything sort of falls into place like a great jigsaw puzzle. So you, in effect, you do have a sort of conversion. You have what Kuhn calls a paradigm shift, but on the level of a society's whole world view.
To me, the ecological message really is the recognition that we can never predict what are the implications of our tampering with natural systems and with social systems. That we know so little about these systems that the best way to act is in very tiny, hesitant steps to make sure that what we do is actually strengthening to the system rather than eroding it.
Considering how disastrous development has been around the world, its impact both on culture and nature, what we need now is counter-development. We urgently need a massive educational campaign to counter present trends. We need to educate people around the world and their political leaders of the need for a radical turnaround. This campaign could be very capital intensive, ideally it should be, because it needs to use all the media and it needs to reach people around the world as urgently and as rapidly as possible. And this is the only way that we can allow diverse local responses and sane, sustainable ways of living around the planet, which will have to be diverse. There is no single formula, because they have to be a response to specific ecosystems and cultural traditions around the world. And so that this counter-development campaign is necessary in order to allow the flowering of really sustainable alternatives.
There's actually very little hope, as I see it. But at the same time, as long as a glimmer of hope exists, then I think we can keep on fighting. And this glimmer of hope exists because increasingly more and more people, especially the younger people, are realizing why there is something wrong with this system and what it is that is wrong with the system, and what the solutions are in the long run. And they are beginning to fight. They are beginning to become more green. They are beginning to reject the assumptions that underpin this whole system. They are beginning to have visions of a different kind of world and a different kind of system within which we can be more in harmony with fellow human beings and also with nature.